So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. And please, feel free as I go on if you have questions about if any aspect of this as I'm going along you have any questions about, please feel free to ask me about them. But I'll get going with this. So first of all, I wanted to introduce the onion as a plant. One of the most important things to understand in order to grow onions, and this is true of almost any plant you want to grow. I don't know if any of you ever knew Paul Rogers. Paul was my mentor for a long time at Old Sturbridge Village. I learned a lot from Paul, and one of the most significant things I learned from him is what I call plant empathy, that the best way to garden, to grow things, is sort of like getting along with other people. If the more you understand about the plant, about its needs and its desires and its preferences, the more successful you're going to be at growing it. And so I like to structure my specific plant talks to help people understand more about a particular plant. So first of all, onions are native to Western Asia, and they are cold hardy. So what that means is that an onion plant can withstand light frost. It won't live through the winter easily here in New England because a real freeze will kill it here. But it is tolerant of light frost, so we don't have to wait until there's no frost to plant onions out in our garden. The other thing is to understand is that it's a biennial, and I'm going to go into more detail about that in a couple minutes. A biennial plant will live for 2 years. I find in talking with people, most gardeners are very familiar with annual plants, a plant that only lives for one growing season, and they're familiar with perennial plants, plants that'll live for 3 years or longer. But a lot of people are not as familiar with biennials, so I'm going to talk about that in some detail. The bulb, the part that we're really interested in when we grow an onion, usually, although the leaves of an onion certainly are edible, we can use those. When we're growing an onion, we usually want to be able to harvest a nice onion bulb. The onion bulb is actually, from the plant's point of view, it's a food storage organ. So from the onion's point of view, that bulb that we want to harvest is a food storage organ. And it's actually, a bulb is actually very specialized leaves. So all of those little layers inside the onion, those are leaves that have developed in a specialized form in order to create that bulb, which is a food storage organ. So understanding some of these things about the plant are key to knowing how to grow it successfully. When an onion forms a bulb as its food storage organ, it does that because the part of the world, Western Asia, where the onion originated has a very dry period in between the first year of the onion's life and the second year of the onion's life. And bulbs are food storage organs that are designed to succeed in very dry conditions. If you think about just how, even if you didn't grow your own onions, if you bought onions at the grocery store to have at home, you're not going to buy them in a plastic bag. They're going to come in a mesh bag. You're not going to put them in the hydrator drawer, or you shouldn't, in your refrigerator. You're going to store them in a dry place instead. And so this is because of the nature of the onion. So to get a little bit more detail about this is an illustration that kind of shows you the onion's life cycle from year 1 to year 2. So in the beginning, way over on the left, we get a seed in the ground, and then the seed germinates. It creates a plant. The plant makes leaves, and then the plant begins to create a bulb. And it's creating that bulb. The leaves are the part of the plant that can make food. This is the thing I tell people, we really should be a lot more respectful of plants than we are. When I talk with children at Old Sturbridge Village, I like to explain to them, and to adults too, we're struggling to learn how to use solar energy. We're still new at this. Plants have been doing it for thousands of years, using solar energy. And what do they do with it? Something we can't do. They make food. We can cook it, prepare it for the table, but we can't make it. Only plants can do that, and they use solar energy. So the leaves here are using solar energy, combining it with nutrients that they're taking up out of the soil, and they are creating food in those leaves. That's a step that's necessary in order to then begin to create a bulb. So when the bulb starts to be created, what's happening is each of these leaves has this specialized leaf form that is starting to store food to make a bulb. So food is moving from the leaves down into the leafy structures in the bulb, and that bulb is gradually growing as the leafy structure makes the food. It keeps getting bigger and bigger, and then it is triggered, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in a minute, by changes in the length of the day to decide, okay, now I've got to go dormant. So again, plant empathy. Think like an onion plant. You are programmed by Mother Nature to live for 2 years. In your first year, your task is to form a bulb that will store the energy and stay alive between year 1 and year 2. And so you're under a calendar with Mother Nature. You have to have this job done by a particular point in the year. And how do you know when that's coming? By how long the days are. Actually, by how long the nights are. The plant is really paying more attention to that, but we call it day length sensitivity. So the plant has to take these steps. When the days reach certain lengths, the plant has to move from one step to another. And so it moves to going dormant. And that's what happens over the wintertime. It's too cold, there's not enough light to grow, so what happens is all of the leaves on the top of the plant die down because they've stored, all the food they made is now stored to make an onion bulb, and the onion bulb is just going to rest, and it's like a hibernating animal. It's just going to stay alive but not doing anything in particular through the winter months. Then, when the days begin to lengthen again and the soil begins to warm up in year 2, the onion moves into its second year of biennial growth. I tell people, I think if I was going to die and be resurrected as a plant, I'd probably like to come back as a biennial because I'm not a very good multitasker. So biennials don't have to do the whole thing in 1 year. They separate their jobs out between 2 years. And in year 2, before the plant dies, its contract with Mother Nature says you've got to make seeds because that ensures the future of onions. And so the onion begins to send up new leaves, but it doesn't send up a whole lot of leaves in the second year because leaves are designed to make food, and it already made a huge amount of food. So it doesn't need as many leaves in the second year. So what it will do is it will focus on sending up a flower spike, a flower stem. It will bloom, get pollinated, using energy from this bulb, and then it will set seeds, and then it will die, and its job is over. The only thing about this drawing, which I lifted from an online source, that I would change is the way the bulbs are drawn. Have you ever had an onion in your house that you bought or you grew yourself? Have you ever had it start to sprout, get a green shoot coming out of the top? So what happens to the bulb when that happens?
It's shrink and soften.
It gets really soft, right. And the flavor even changes. It's kind of a weird flavor. So you can't really eat it at that point. So in these drawings, it would be more accurate if these bulbs began to shrink, because that's what happens. The food that's in the onion now is going up into that top growth to be used to make a flower and to make seeds before the onion dies. So this is the onion's life cycle. It's like any biennial. It's also the secret to why onions are such good storage vegetables when you harvest them from the garden. Why you can bring a bunch of onions in, and if you put them in the right kind of conditions, if you put them somewhere where they're not inclined to think it's time to grow, they'll keep because they're not dead. They're still alive. And we've actually, one of the things that was a real eye-opening experience for me when I started growing vegetables at Old Sturbridge Village was how many common vegetables are biennials. And they are vegetables that store well. Carrots, beets, parsnips, turnips. They are all biennials. If you think about, and the thing that amazed me was I had been growing things like carrots and parsnips and beets for many years before I started to work at the village, every spring preparing a bed, putting seeds into the ground, watching the leafy green foliage grow, watching the carrot form down below ground, then harvesting the carrot, bringing it indoors, eating it. And it never occurred to me to wonder where you get seeds from a carrot. Have you ever wondered that? If you've never had a carrot bolt in your garden, then you've probably never seen a carrot produce flowers and seeds, because it's a biennial, and you dig it up out of your garden before it enters its second year. If you put it back into the garden so it could grow in its second year, you'd get a plant that looks just like Queen Anne's lace. The food in the carrot would get used up the way the food in the onion does, and it would produce the flowering plant in the second year, and then it would die. And this is the reason why all of these root vegetables and this bulb vegetable could be stored in root cellars in people's houses without a few might spoil if they were damaged or injured, but most of them will stay just as fresh if they get packed in a box of sand, so they feel like they're still in the ground, dormant between year 1 and year 2. They will stay perfectly healthy and good because they're not dead. They're just hibernating.
Are potatoes biennials too?
Potatoes are perennials, and they're a little bit different. They have a slightly different way of reproducing. So I won't take the time right now from this talk to go into that. But they're a tuber, and a tuber is a food storage organ, but it's different. You probably know that potatoes have little eyes on them that will produce shoots, so they become the plant the next year. It's a little bit different, similar idea, but a little bit different. I mentioned here the plant gets vernalized. So right in here, what happens between here and here, the plant gets cold. It experiences cold and short days, and that makes it go into its dormant mode. Then it warms up, and that's called vernalizing. Vernal means spring, like vernal pools. This is spring. So now the plant, after it goes through a cold spell for a period of time and then gets warm, that's what tells it it's time to grow again. That's called vernalizing, and that will make the plant bolt. It will make it flower. And so that's what's happened when you bring your onions into your house and you keep them in a place where it's warm and where they're exposed to some light. Then they get vernalized because they've been cold before, and now they get warm and get light, and that's what makes them start to flower, is that vernalization process. Onions are day-length sensitive plants. Those are called photoperiodic plants. They, as I mentioned earlier, we call it day-length sensitive. What scientists have since discovered is it's actually the length of the night that is, the two are partners in the daytime, but the length of the night that actually the plant is really paying attention to. But this is what it uses to plan out its decisions about what to do next, essentially. So onion plants, they're programmed by nature to form bulbs in response to the day length. So when you put an onion seed into the ground, or you put a very young onion plant out into your garden, in the beginning it's thinking, I need to make some leaves, need to grow some leaves. When the day length reaches a certain point, about 14 hours of light in the day for long day onions, which are the kind we grow here in New England, that tells the plant, okay, it's time to stop using all your energy to make leaves. You've got to start making a bulb, because if you don't start now, you won't have a time to get it done before your time runs out. And so no matter how big the leafy part of the plant is, when the day length reaches that point, the plant's going to stop making more leaves and start focusing on using the energy in those leaves to make a bulb. So in the Northeast, we grow what are called long day onions, and that's because we have longer days here than they have in the South. And those are the best onions to choose. Long day onion varieties are the best onions to choose here. Short day onions would start to bulb too soon here, and you wouldn't get big enough bulbs from them. Our long days would trigger them too early into bulb formation. They work fine in the south, but they don't work so good here, so well here. So the energy will shift from leaf growth to bulb growth at about 14 or 15 hours of daylight, and then they'll keep doing that up until about July, and then they will begin to go dormant. So we'll look more closely at that too. So this is important to keep in mind as you plant your onions. When the leaves have converted to the bulb, when the leaf has put all of its food down into a bulb, then it's going to go dormant. And the size of the bulb depends on the amount of top growth. So you can't get a big onion if you haven't got a lot of leaves growing, strong leaves growing up on the top. And so the more time you have your onion growing in the spring to make good leaf growth, the more leaves it's going to have and the bigger your bulb is going to be. This one's a little exaggerated, but I want to use it to make a point.
Well, could that have been grown in Alaska, where they actually produce giant vegetables? I think because of daylight.
Yeah, well, and this is, I'm going to talk with you, talk with you about a variety called Ailsa Craig, which is one that does make even here we can make some pretty big onions with Ailsa Craig if we grow them the right way. It's one of my favorites. It's kind of fun to grow. So there are several different ways that you can plant onions here in New England. 3 basic ways to plant them. 2 of the ways are starting with a seed. They can be seeds that you plant right out in the ground in your garden as soon as the ground can be worked. Again, our goal is to have our onions growing as long as possible before they start making a bulb. So that means you want to be able to get them in the ground as soon as possible. As I mentioned right in the beginning, they are cold hardy plants. They can't live when it's frozen outdoors, but we can put onion seeds into the ground. The phrase that was used historically was as soon as the ground can be worked, and that can vary from year to year. So what that means is as soon as snow has gone off the ground, as soon as the ground has thawed and it's not ice anymore, as soon as the winter wet has drained away from the ground enough so that the soil won't glue and stick together too much, and you can get out there with your tools and work your soil. As soon as that's happened, and around here it's typically often the middle of April that this happens, sometimes earlier, sometimes a little later, but usually the middle of April is when the ground can be worked in the garden. As soon as the ground can be worked, we can get onions into the ground. So we want to get them in as early as possible. Planting them directly in the ground from seed, though, in New England, can be a challenging task for us to get good onions that way. Of course, historically, in the 19th century, that was pretty much the choice for people. And what they tended to do was to select onion varieties that would be the most successful grown from seed. So oftentimes if you decide you wanted to experiment with direct sowing onions in your garden, the best thing to do is to look for ones that have a short maturity time. On your seed package it will tell you that, and to look for heirloom varieties. So one variety that would work for this that's still around, an heirloom variety, is called New York Early onion, and that's an old variety. It makes a nice onion. I grow them in my garden at home, and if you wanted to experiment with that, you could use that one. But it is a more challenging way to grow onions than the next 2 methods. You could also start your seeds indoors. I'm starting mine right now indoors under lights, so that I can grow the plants as long as possible. I can get small plants started now indoors. I'll grow those for the rest of this month and right through March and into April inside. I'll get plants that are maybe about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch in diameter by the time I reach the middle of April, and then I can plant them outdoors in my garden, and then they'll grow on from there. So that gives me a a head start over what you would get with direct sowing them in the garden. You're starting with a small plant instead of with a seed that germinates. So you can start them anytime from late January to into the middle of February. Some people wait until later in February. For me, over my years of experimenting with the varieties I grow, I find the middle of February is a good time for me to start them inside and then transplant them outside in the garden in April. The other way to grow, yeah.
How long do you have the lights on for?
I start them out at 10 hours, and then I gradually increase that amount of time with I use shop lights. I'll show you my seed starter stand in just a minute. And then the other way to grow onions is with what are called onion sets, and I'll talk about those too so we know what those are. So there are a couple of advantages to growing onions from seed. One of them is that it's the least expensive method, buying seed, and the other is that it gives you the biggest selection of different kinds of onions to grow, because you can buy a lot of different onion varieties through catalogs, online, in seed racks that are out right now in garden centers and stores. You can find a lot of different varieties to grow them from seed. Seed really gives you an opportunity to control the growing conditions for the small plant as well, so you know you've controlled it right from the very beginning for your garden. Onion seed, though, it's very important to note, onion seed is a very short-lived seed. The viability period for onion seed is 1 to 2 years. So you don't want to try and grow onions from seed that's over 2 years old. You're going into a project that's kind of intensive to begin with. You don't want to program yourself to fail by using seed that is likely to not be viable. So you want fresh seed. So at Old Sturbridge Village, that's the first place I ever grew onions from direct sown, because what we're trying to do is show you the way people did things in the 1830s. And they didn't have the option of going to garden centers and buying started plants or starting them indoors under grow lights or any of the options that we have today. So they had to grow them. And this is an image of the New York early onion. The ones that are pulled in the Freeman Farm Garden photo on the left, that's one called Southport White Globe. It was named for Southport, Connecticut, where that was a big onion growing area in the 19th century. They had big onion farms in Connecticut, and Southport White Globe was a variety that was developed and used there. And you can still find that one in some seed catalogs as well. So those are the varieties that are most likely to be successful outdoors, ones that can go from seed to a finished, they're early maturing varieties that go from seed to a finished bulb quickly. And those, if you're going to try that, you want to look for those varieties.
Are those the purple onions on the left, or are those just mutant?
Oh, the purple one is probably a red Weathersfield. Red Weathersfield is another, yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. That's another historic variety developed in Weathersfield, Connecticut, again, for the Connecticut growing onion business of the 19th century. So it's a good choice as well if you're going to try and direct sow. It can be, any of these varieties can also be started indoors, but they're your best choice if you're going to start them directly outside. So if you're going to do that, as I mentioned, you want to start as soon as the ground can be worked, and that's usually in April. And you would prepare beds. I'm going to talk in a few minutes in more detail about preparing the ground to receive onions. The same method would be used if you're going to put in seeds or if you're going to put in transplants. But the seeds get planted about 1/2 inch deep. You would space your rows, your onion rows, between 12 and 18 inches apart. It might seem, if an onion, is only going to get about this big, it might seem like you can put rows closer together than that. One of the main reasons you don't want to, though, is because of the above ground leafy growth. If that is too dense, you can have fungal problems. This is not just true with onions, it's true with almost every vegetable you grow in your garden. When we get humid weather, especially if we get a lot of rain, and the leaves, if the foliage on plants remains wet for long periods of time, we are, if you're gardeners, you're probably aware, we're experiencing more fungal diseases now than we did 20 years ago. And if your foliage on your plants remains wet, it makes them much more susceptible to funguses, because funguses spread by spores that are very fine and they can blow for miles in the air. And if a plant is wet, those spores will stick onto the plant. And if they stick onto the plant, then they grow into the plant and infect the plant with the disease. So our goal with onions and everything we grow in our garden is to avoid having leaves that stay wet for long periods of time. When it rains outdoors, we don't have any control over that. But if we space plants out, that allows more air circulation and it allows more sunlight to penetrate, and that helps to reduce that moisture on the surface of the plant leaves. So spacing things isn't just enough room for the plant to grow what you're going to harvest. It has other benefits as well. And thinning your onions, the individual onion plants in the row spacing, that's going to be based on the size of the mature onion you're growing. So if you're growing Cipollini onions that are small, used for making braised onions, they can be a little closer together in the row. If you're growing Ailsa Craig, where you want to get an onion that's going to be this big, then they have to be no closer than that, or they're not going to have enough space to get that big. That's kind of logical. So you think of spacing in terms of the room that the bulb is going to need. And I'll show you in a minute transplants in the ground. And when you first put things in, this is true of onions, but also tomatoes or anything else. When you put a small plant in, and they're 6 inches, or with tomatoes 2 feet apart, you say to yourself, oh, I could put them closer together than that. But you've got to think about where they're going to be at when they're more mature. And we need to keep the soil evenly moist for onions. This is something that's true for almost every vegetable you grow in your garden, is if plants go through a wet spell and then they go really dry and then they go wet again, those shocks in between can shut down growth. When a plant goes through some kind of stress, what it's going to do to protect itself is slow down its growth. And lack of water is going to be stress. And extremes, going from extreme of wet to extreme of dry to extreme of wet, that's plant stress, and that is going to modify the plant's growth. It's going to change its growth rate. So trying to keep things even, keeping it evenly moist. You don't want your plant to be overly watered and too wet, and preparing the soil to make sure it drains well is a good way to prevent that in the beginning. But you don't want it to go through periods of wet to dry, wet to dry. So even moisture, even watering. And when you're just planting out seed and watering, you have to be careful not to water with something like an overhead sprinkler, because the weight of the water that falls on the surface of your soil over your seeds can make a crust. It can almost create a pavement on the top of your garden soil that makes it very hard for seeds to come up from that. So this was something, again, that I learned from Paul Rogers. He used to tell me what scientists had measured as the impact of the weight of the water that can come down from one of those large overhead sprinklers, and it can really compact the soil. And compacted soil is one of the biggest, whether you do it with your feet or whether you do it with water or with tools or whatever, that's a big problem for things growing in our garden, particularly for seedlings, but even for more mature plants. Okay, it's the part of the world that onions are native to is moist during the growing season and dry during the winter. So yeah, so they're not, I should have been more clear about that probably in the beginning, that so they're adapted to consistent moisture, not overwater, but consistent moisture during their growing period. But in the wintertime, that climate is more dry. So that's why onions developed a bulb as their food storage organ. Carrots developed a root, because carrots developed in the middle of Europe, where the soil remains moist during the winter. And so they needed a food storage organ that would stay alive and not spoil in moist soil. and the onion needed a food storage organ. Well, think of where our bulb flowers come from. They originated from the same part of the world. Things like tulips and crocuses, for example. Their bulb is the same as the onion. It's when you put a bulb in the ground, your tulip plant grows up, it makes food, it adds to the size of the bulb, and it dies down. But the bulb doesn't die. The bulb stays alive in the ground and produces a plant or maybe multiple plants the next year. But they evolved in parts of the world where the time when they were dormant, the soil was more dry than wet. And so a bulb works better for that. Yeah, isn't that neat stuff? I remember when I learned this, I thought, boy, aha. So onion sets are another way to grow onions. And we can, in a month or so, you'll probably start seeing onion sets for sale in nursery centers and garden centers. They'll have boxes of them. Onion sets were created by growers by planting onions very close together from seed. So what happened with those onions was they went dormant faster than normal. They didn't grow big before they went dormant. And so what you've got when they grow onion sets, the goal is to make an onion go dormant before it's really finished its first year mentally of growth. And so what you hope is then you can pick it up, put it in the ground, and it'll kind of pick up where it left off and continue to make a finished bulb. And because that's where these guys are at, you want to make sure when you buy, it could be tempting when you see a bin full of onion sets to pick out a bunch of big ones, right? Think, oh, I'm going to get some big onions from those. However, that's not a good way to go. If they're over an inch in diameter, they may have moved to the point where they feel like they've finished their first year of growth, and then when you plant them, instead of making a bigger bulb, they'll bolt and go to flower and seed. So this is one of the downsides of sets, is that there's always the potential that that could happen. Also, if they get exposed to cold, temperatures below 50 degrees for a couple of weeks, and then they get exposed to warmth, they'll be vernalized. And that will also make them move into their second year of growth instead of making a bigger bulb. So if you buy sets, make sure that you get them in the ground right away and you don't chill them and then warm them up, that they get into the ground at the right period of time. And that you buy ones that are about 3/4 of an inch in diameter is a good size, not larger than an inch in diameter. Nice, healthy ones. Those are the best. You can make a little trench in your garden, put them into the trench with the pointed side up. The bottom will be the roots, and just push them down in about an inch or so deep, just slightly below the surface with the tip of the onion, and 3 to 4 inches apart, because you don't really need to thin those. They're in for their final growing. And again, the rows about the same distance apart as you would do even from seed for onions. So starting onions indoors. So this is a shot across my seed starting stand, and these are some onions, the grassy looking ones in here, along with a bunch of other things that are getting started indoors early. My husband built this stand for me some years ago. It's great because it accommodates 4 shop lights. So I've got 2 levels of seed starting under 4-foot-long shop lights. And that's these, here are onions right here growing under those lights. And you, like with any of the plants that we grow under lights, when we start them and we start the seed in some flats, and with onions, I think some of my other pictures in a few minutes will show you, because you're growing a bunch of plants that are going to go very straight up, not out, you can put them pretty close together. I have found that the best kind of containers to sow your seeds in are not the cell packs with the little cells, but an open flat. And you used to be able to buy those open flats easily. Now they're harder to find. I've kept a bunch of old ones that I've had for a long time. But another source is in your grocery store. If you buy things like mushrooms and you get them in the little plastic containers that are they're just about the right depth to use for start. You just have to punch holes in the bottom so that they'll be well drained. And I've used those as seed starters as well as some of the purchased flats that I use. And you can sow your seeds in those flats in a seed starter mix. You don't want to ever use garden soil when you're starting seeds indoors, because garden soil will have all kinds of organisms in it that plants can deal with outdoors, but they can't deal with indoors. You're putting bacteria and various other kinds of living organisms that could be harmful to seedlings into a kind of idealized environment here, and you could end up with funguses and other problems. So you want a soil mix that you can buy that's intended. You can get organic seed starter mixes at a garden center and plant into that. And then when you're watering these, the seed starter mix should be moist when you put the seeds into it. But then as you are growing them, to water them, what I keep, I have a regular like 13-inch baking pan, and I use that for my watering device and water from the bottom. This is really good advice for a couple of reasons. What I would do is I would take this and put a little bit of room temperature water in it, then take my seed flat and just set it in that and let the water go up from the bottom. What happens then is that the most moisture, if you start from the bottom, the wettest part is going to be down at the bottom, not up at the top. One of the risks with starting seeds indoors is something called damping off fungus. And that can happen when the soil on the top of your seed flat stays too wet too long. And you get this fungus, and what you'll see is seedlings right near where the stem joins the soil. The stem will begin to get rotted and they'll just kind of drop over. That's damping off fungus. And it's caused by the surface of the soil being too wet, that moisture. Watering from the bottom, so you set it in the tray and water it just until that topsoil begins to look dark and moist, and then take them out. And that, I find that's the best way to water. When you first start the seed, you would start it over some bottom heat, so you do get some warmth from your grow lights, but if you use a seed starting mat that gives you some bottom heat, that will speed up the germination. But because onions like to grow in cool weather, you want to, as soon as your seed germinates, you want to take that heat mat away and let them grow on under cool conditions. Similarly, you can use a dome over your flats while you're waiting for the seed to germinate. That helps to keep them moist so you don't have to do watering while the seed is just germinating. But once the seed has germinated, you want to take the dome off too, because if you leave it on, that keeps them too humid. And again, that can lead to damping off. So the warmth below and the dome are just to get the onions started. And then once they're started, they won't need that anymore indoors. If you hunt, you can still find some of these. Well, they make the large trays without the cells in them for commercial growers, but for home gardeners, it's better to have smaller seed starter boxes. So this is what you're going to start to get with your seedlings, and they'll get tall and they can get kind of floppy. So if your seeds come up closer together than 1/8 of an inch, you want to thin them out. They can be, as seedlings, they can be growing closer together in these flats than they're going to in their final stage, because you're going to move them outdoors and space them out. You want to set your timer for between 10 to 12 hours of light and then gradually increase it. What you're looking to is to have them up to about where your day length is going to be in the middle of April. When you put them outside, you want the day length to match what they've been, or be greater than what they've been doing indoors. You don't want to go from greater indoors to lesser outdoors. Keeping the soil evenly moist, as I mentioned, by setting it in a tray of room temperature water. And then every couple of weeks for indoor seedlings, once they get up and growing like this, and you're going to have them growing indoors from the middle of February. Well, middle of February is just seed in the mix, but from the end of February, when you're starting to get some actual plants indoors, you'll have those growing through the month of March and the first half of April. And during that time, when you've got plants growing like this, you want to add a little bit of extra food to them to keep them well fed. And a good way to do that is to use a liquid fertilizer. I use either a seaweed emulsion or a fish emulsion fertilizer and mix it at half strength, not full strength. And then use that the same way you would water the plants. So you mix some of that up and then as a liquid, set the flat into that just as you would when you were watering and let them take up some of that liquid feed. That provides them with a little bit of extra nutrients when they're beginning to use up what's in the seed starter mix to keep them growing healthy.
What about the liquid that collects at the bottom of my vermicompost? I use that.
Compost tea?
Yeah.
I'm going to mention that when you go outdoors. You probably could use that indoors. I usually wait until my plants go out and I use that as a liquid feed outdoors more than I do indoors. I guess I don't have evidence about whether there would be any, fungal potentials like you get in garden soil, for example. It's not sterilized and so on. That would be the only reason I would favor using it outdoors once the plants go out rather than bringing it indoors. But certainly, you use it to water houseplants and things like that. So once the plants get to this size, you could certainly try it. I don't think there's likely to be a big risk with that. But yeah, it does. Compost tea does give you many of the same benefits you get from the seaweed or the fish emulsion fertilizers.
Oh, you have that. Okay.
When these leaves on the plants begin to get really tall and they flop over, you can trim them to about 3 inches tall. What that will do is that will encourage them to make thicker leaves and stems. They'll keep growing and keep making new leaves. You don't want these to be over about 1/8 of an inch thick when you take them outside, but you want them to be nice and thick and sturdy when they go out, and you don't want them flopping over too much, so you can trim them. That works fine. It helps make the plant thicker. Then preparing the garden to receive. This same preparation would be whether you were going to direct sow seed outside or whether you were going to move plants outside. So in my garden, I grow in 4-foot wide beds. And the reason I do that is because I don't want to walk on my soil. And if I have 4-foot wide beds, I can work into the bed from either side of it. I make a pathway on this side and I've got a pathway on that side, so that I can walk between the beds but not in the bed at all. And that prevents soil compaction, and that really works well. So we want to enrich the soil, as is the case for almost any garden space. Doing a soil test in the fall is a really good idea because that's like your routine physical that you get where they do tests and you get back a report on what your status is. This tells you where your soil is at. It'll tell you where it's at as far as acidity or alkalinity, so you'll know with onions they want to have a pH neutral soil, not too acid, particularly they don't like acidity, not too alkaline, so if it tests acid as our New England soil tends to be by nature, then you'd want to add a little lime to your soil to bring it more alkaline for the onions to be happy in. A sandy loam is a really ideal soil. The nice thing about a sandy loam is the little bit of sand in it means that any extra water drains away and doesn't make the soil really soggy. But the loam will hold water, so you get this balance of drainage and holding water together. But one way to build that is to add compost to your garden. Compost can correct both too wet and too dry soil. With the soil that's too wet, compost is more porous, and so it allows excess water to drain away. With soil that's too sandy and too dry, compost has absorbent qualities, and so it will hold moisture. So it's really interesting that it solves two really different kinds of problems. You want to remove stones, because anything that's you're going to value to grow underground, whether it's an onion or a carrot or a parsnip, is not going to do well if it has stones that interfere with it. And then the nutrients adding, Nitrogen is the nutrient that plants use mostly to make leafy growth and stems. The green growth relies on some nitrogen. So early in the season, and you can prepare this soil in the fall too. And you can do it in the spring, but a lot of soil preparation can be done in the fall, especially for crops like onions that you're going to want to get in early. So you could add fresh manure in the fall, and by the time you got to spring, that would have aged enough so that it would be safe to plant into at that point. And then you just need to loosen that soil up in the spring for your planting. But the nitrogen will, early in the growing season of the onions, that will stimulate those strong leaves that we want. And then potassium and phosphorus contribute to the development of roots and bulbs. And so having a good amount of that in. So when you get to the point when you're planting here, you can add things like wood ash, for example, a dusting of wood ash that will give you some potassium, or you can use a balanced fertilizer, whatever, to give you the nutrients that you need. But the onions are going to need a little bit of both, and the nitrogen is going to be more important early in the growth of the plant. Once the onion begins to bulb up, then it's going to rely more heavily on the potassium and the phosphorus. So you could add something like blood meal, for example, is very high in nitrogen. Putting that into the soil when you first put the plants out would be good, but you don't need to keep adding that later on because you want the plant to not to move from leaves into bulb growth later on. So these are some transplanted onion seedlings in my garden one year when I did that on the 26th of April. So you want to make sure that your bed is really moist before you move seedlings in. That's true of any seedling because you don't want what you're going to do is you're going to take these little seedlings gently from the little flats that you've been growing them in. You're going to tease them apart. One nice thing about onions is they don't mind being transplanted, so they'll take a little bit of root disturbance without a big problem. In fact, some growers claim that they actually will benefit and that it will actually stimulate new growth by transplanting them. But you don't want these roots to dry out, so you want to make sure you're not separating too many of these at once out and exposing them to the air. Keep them moist as they go into the ground. Make sure that they go into moist ground so that they don't dry out. And they can be planted a little deeper, like an inch deep or so when they're put into the ground. So I typically will make a trench and set my seedlings in, then pull the soil up around them, and then just lightly tap that down to make sure that the roots are not in an air pocket, and then water them in. Give them a good drink. That not only gives them a drink, but it settles the soil down around the roots so you don't have them in an air pocket underground. So, and about 4 to 6 inches apart. Again, the spacing between plants would be gauged by what type of onion you're growing, how big that onion bulb is going to be and what space it's going to need. And floating row covers, I use these a lot in my garden now. I have found this, it's sold under a couple of names. Sometimes Agribon is one of the names it's sold under. It's a floating row cover. These floating row covers will allow rain to go through and they allow sunlight to penetrate so plants can grow fine underneath them. If you tuck them into the soil, you buy these flexible metal things that you make the hoops for them, and I use clothespins just to clip them onto those metal hoops and then tuck them into the ground. They protect plants from insects. They keep the environment inside a little bit warmer. So if there's any fear when you put your onions out that you might get some really cold temperatures that could damage them, got to mention hardening off. Then putting that cover over will help. It kind of gives them a period of adjustment when they're not going to be subject to wind. That's something they have to get used to because they didn't have any wind indoors. And more intense sunlight. This gives them a little bit modified sunlight outdoors. So it's great for any kind of transplants. But I find it works really well with my onions outdoors. And I didn't mention hardening off. Hardening off is the process that we do to get plants to be able to easily shift from the conditions they were growing in your house to the conditions they're going to grow in outdoors. And there are a couple things they need to adjust to. One is more intense light. You know, you're growing them under grow lights indoors, but the sunlight that they're going to encounter outside is much more intense than our grow lights. And so they have to get adjusted to that. The cell structure has to change. Also, wind, movement of air. If you go into greenhouses where they're growing plants for people, you'll often see fans in there. And that allows the air to move, and that will make, when the plants are subject to moving air, they build stronger cells to resist that. And so that's another adjustment. So to harden onions off, as with anything we were going to move from indoors to outdoors, we'd want to start by taking them outdoors for a few hours each day and then bringing them back indoors. And when you first start that and take them outdoors, choose a spot that's a little bit sheltered so it's not exposed to a lot of wind, and where it might be a little bit shady, not full sun, so that in the beginning they're getting eased into those outdoor conditions. And you want to harden them off for 10 days to 2 weeks or so before they go outdoors permanently. So you'll extend the amount of time you take them outdoors. You'll gradually move them from a more sheltered location out into a more open location, and then you'll finally get to the point where you're leaving them outdoors overnight. And then when they've gotten that full adjustment, then they'll be ready to get transplanted out into the garden. And again, the row cover can also extend that adjustment period a little bit by tempering conditions. And this stuff is great. I use it over when I plant squash plants. I put this with a dome over my squash plants and keep that over them until they need pollinators to get in, until the flowers begin to open and I need pollinators to make the squash mature. I leave this over it, and by doing that I've been able to avoid squash vine borers, because the insect that lays the eggs tends to do that early in the growing season of the squash. So if I keep them covered with the edges all tucked into the soil so that that moth can't get in there, I have found that I can usually avoid squash vine borers by doing that. And then watering, again, mentioned that consistent watering is good. So this is what your onions will look like then by early June, when they've been growing through the last part of April and through May and into the first few weeks of June. This is what you want. You want really healthy looking leaves like that. That shows you've got a plant that can make a really good bulb here. They've got some mulch on them to hold the moisture in, to keep the soil moist. Also, mulch will cut down on weeds. I'll mention in a minute the importance of that with the onions. And then when watering, you want to water until the soil is really well moistened, but it's good to time that watering. Do it in the morning rather than in the evening. That way the plant has time, while the sun is still out during the day, has time for moisture to dry off the foliage. If you can aim your water just down, I should be holding this thing right down near the soil, and just water the soil instead of the plants themselves. That's an even better way to go. Or drip irrigation that you can spread through your bed. Not quite as easy to do with rows of onions as it is with things like tomatoes, for example, but that allows you to water just the soil and not get the plants really wet. If you have questions while I'm going along, feel free. Oh, and the other thing that the mulch does is it keeps the soil temperature even. So now we're getting these intense sunny days in our summers, and that can heat the soil up a lot. And the onions don't want the soil to get really hot. So putting a mulch on forms a kind of an insulation that protects them against that, as well as holding in the moisture. And then liquid feeding. So we've enriched the soil before we put the onions in with things like compost, well-rotted manure, maybe a purchased organic fertilizer mix blend. But when these are growing, they're taking that nutrient out of the soil. You know, they're at the table eating. So what you put in the beginning isn't going to last all the way through the whole season. The plant is using that up. So there are a couple of things that you want to do, especially at this point where we're thinking, okay, these plants are going to start forming bulbs now. So you might want to do what's called top dressing. You could take some compost and just sprinkle it on the top of the soil, tickle the soil a little bit just to get that to blend into your soil. A good fertilizer mix just tickled in, a little bit of wood ash here and there to give the potassium that they need. And then liquid feed, the difference, what you've put on the top like compost, those fertilizers added to the soil, before the plant can actually eat those have to get broken down by soil microorganisms. They're kind of the cooks in the soil for the fertilizer. They're going to process that fertilizer that you put on, break it down, and get it into a form where it can be dissolved in water. Once that happens, then the plant can eat those nutrients. But the compost or well broken down manure, a lot of that, some of it will be able to be dissolved in water right away, but not all of it will until the soil microorganisms work on it. And so to kind of fill in the gap, liquid fertilizers like fish emulsion or seaweed emulsion, those are already water-soluble fertilizers. So when you add those, the plant can use those right away. I always tell people it's a balance in your soil between the two. You want to make sure you have the slow-release fertilizers there that will last and slowly give up nutrients for your plants over time. And you want to use the liquid feeds as a boost. It's like an intravenous feeding. It's only there right away, and then it's gone. So you need the slow release as the backup, the liquid feed to give you what you need instantly while the slow release isn't producing. So it's good to have a balance of those two. And then onions hate competition. They have small root systems, as you probably know. If you've harvested an onion, doesn't have a great big bunch of roots on it like a tomato plant does. And so if it has competition from weeds, it's going to really suffer from that. So you want to start weeding early while the weeds are still small, and pulling them out isn't going to injure that small root system on your onion, and get them out quickly. I love this poem from 1829. Since the best way of weeding is to prevent weeds from seeding, the least procrastination of any operation to prevent the dissemination of noxious vegetation is a source of tribulation. And this in truth a fact is, which gardeners ought to practice, and tillers should remember, from April to December. So then when onions mature, we were talking about their life cycle, now they're getting ready to go dormant. When they feel like they have put all their nutrients down and their bulb is mature, the sign is that the leaves will start to fall over. The area right where the leaves join the bulb, the neck, will thin. It will get really thin, and that top will just drop right over. When that happens, then you know the leaves on the top are no longer feeding the bulb. And so this is a point where you can harvest your onions. You might leave them for a brief period of time in the garden and withhold water to promote their curing. As I said, in their natural environment, the onions would be going into a dry season when they were starting to cure. So as much as you can, we can't control Mother Nature, but we wouldn't want to keep watering, we don't need to keep watering them heavily when they get to this point. We want them to go dormant, and they're more comfortable then if the soil begins to get a bit dry. So this is what onions, here are some that we haven't pulled yet with the thin necks and the leaves falling over. These have now been pulled up. So what you'd want to do is take a loose fork, be careful not to puncture your onions, but go below them, just loosen the soil a little, and then they can easily be lifted right up. They can be laid on the surface if you do this on a nice mild day when it's not going to be rainy. Leave them on the surface for several hours until the dirt dries on the surface, so that you don't have to rub them hard in order to remove the bulk of that garden soil. It'll just fall off easily. So you can leave them for that. We don't want to leave them lying out in the garden too long on a hot sunny day, because the heat of the sun can damage the onions. And we also don't want to leave them out if it's going to get wet. One of the things I'll show you in a minute, a picture of some drying on a screen. That may be my next slide. No, there are my grandkids, long time ago. They're both in college now. But here they are harvesting some onions. This is a variety called Patterson, which is a really good long storage onion. This is the Ailsa Craig, the onion that can make really big bulbs. They're a white, more sweet onion. Some of the catalogs that offer Ailsa Craigs for sale will often say that they don't store a long time. I can store mine, and I'll show you where I store them. I can store my Ailsa Craigs, that's what these are here, in my old house cellar, and they'll keep until April anyway, and sometimes May of the next year. So if you have good storage conditions, the Ailsa Craig onions will store pretty well, but they won't keep quite as long as some of the regular round yellow skin varieties of onions. When I can grow a good crop of onions, I never have to buy an onion. I'll have enough onions from my garden to take us through the whole year until I'm starting to get onions in my garden again. These are onions out on a screen in my barn. This is a picture from the High Mowing catalog of onions curing in a greenhouse. I have now got, what I use is an old screen door. I have an old screen door. It gives me a lot of space. I just put it on 2 sawhorses in my barn, so the onions aren't in direct sunlight, but there's good air circulation in that space, and just spread them out. Go out every day or so, just turn them a little bit so that they are curing. And 2 to 3 weeks like this to make them cure, that gets them fully dormant. And then once they're dormant, you can put them into storage. And there are a couple of different ways to store them. The traditional way to store onions was to braid them. And if you leave the tops on them, this is really not hard to do. This is, of course, a woman at Sturbridge Village doing it. What we do is take a piece of garden twine, and you take an onion. It has a nice, you leave the leafy tops on. They'll turn brown, but you want to braid them before the tops get so crisp that they're breaking off easily. Take a piece of twine, and in the middle of that twine, tie it onto that onion right near the neck. So you've got 2 pieces of twine. Then you take 2 more onions, match each of them up with a piece of twine, and then it's just like braiding hair with 3 plates. And as you go along, it's like French braids if you've ever made them. As you go along, you add another onion in to match up with one of those strands, and then add another one, and you just keep on adding them until you've built up this braid of onions, and then that twine has been worked all the way up through it, and you can just tie the twine around the top of the stems in the braid, and then that becomes the hanger to hang the onions up in a storage space. I have a 250-year-old house with an old cellar, which is a great place because it's dark and it's cold and it's some humidity but relatively dry, not wet. And those are the conditions you really need. If you think about the conditions you provide for a plant when you want it to grow, light, warmth, and moisture. So when you don't want it to grow, you store it where it's dark, dry, and cold. So just the opposite kind of conditions. Just to show you a couple of varieties that I've grown, and I've listed those in your handout too. The Ailsa Craig is fun. It's a great sweet onion, really good for making braised onions or roasted vegetables and that kind of thing. You can easily get an onion bulb this big if you're growing them well, and people who really fuss about it can get even bigger ones. The New York Early that I mentioned, that's an early maturing onion, so it comes mature earlier in the garden than many others, but it's also a great storage onion, keeps really well. Red Weathersfield is another, OP means open pollinated or heirloom, so these are all onions. If you allow a couple of those onions of the same variety to go to seed in your garden, you can save the seed and you will get the same variety back as long as you don't allow them to cross cross-pollinate with something else in the garden. And of course, the year you're growing onions for a crop, they're not flowering. So you could do one variety at a time for seed if you want, as long as your neighbors aren't growing others and allowing them to flower. But most of the time, people don't. And then these are the cipollini onions that are nice for making braised onions, little kind of flattened onions. And then two hybrid varieties that I really like. Patterson, in my experience, has been the best long-keeping onion that I've ever grown. They've been really easy to grow. I get great crops from them, and they store for a full year or more. I sometimes have Patterson onions still usable in my cellar the fall after So they're a really good, and Cortland is a really good winter storage keeping onion as well.
Do the Pattersons, do they grow best in New England, or can they grow all over the country?
They're a long day onion, so they need to be in the north where you get the long day. But anywhere where you've got the long days, they'll grow, but they wouldn't grow well in the south.
Okay.
If you decided you wanted to save your own onion seeds, this is what will happen in the second year. So if you took onions that you had grown the year before and stored in your basement, and you'd want to get the more onions are wind and insect pollinated, so you want to have not just one plant going to seed, because you want as many different plants to contribute to your seed genetics as possible to get the strongest genetic diversity in them. So 3 or 4 plants will do it for you. You just put the onion in the ground, and this is what it looks like in that second year. So you can see in the second year, the plant knows it's going to die. It's not wasting much time on leaves. It has used a few leaves to get this going, but now the flowers are up there and the seeds are starting, so the plant's really pretty much shutting down. Once the seed heads come ripe and shed their seeds, then the plant will die. But they're pretty easy to save seed of onions, so if it's something you decide you want to experiment with, that's what the ripe seed heads look like. They're these little capsules, and usually have about 3 seeds in each of those capsules on your onion seed head. So that's one of the problems with onion sets to grow, is that you'll know it's a white onion or a yellow onion or a red onion, but usually the onion sets don't tell you the specific variety at all. So store onions won't tell you usually the named variety. You'll just know it's a white onion. Certainly, and so it could be that the store onion you're buying is a hybrid onion. If it's a hybrid onion, it's not going to come true from seed. A hybrid plant, a hybrid onion variety, like the Patterson, for example, it was created by crossing 2 closely related but different varieties in order to get the qualities combined in the Patterson. So a hybrid plant, the seeds from a hybrid plant are like human children with the same 2 parents. So this hybrid plant has seeds inside it. The fertilization came from a father plant. The seeds were produced on the mother plant. But each of those seeds is like a human child. Each seed is a slightly different combination of the genes from the 2 parents. So they won't be exactly predictable. You'll get an onion, but you won't know exactly what it's going to be like. It might turn out to be a lot like the onion you planted, but it might turn out to be very different than the onion you planted. But if you save seed of an open pollinated variety, like New York Early or Ailsa Craig, anything that's heirloom or open pollinated, those varieties, their parents were both the same variety that they are. And so you know that their genes are going to be consistent in the seeds. So you could try supermarket onions just as an experiment and see what you get, but you might not be happy with the results. Okay, the variety that you're going to plant must be open pollinated, not hybrid. Harvest the seed when it's dry, but before the seed heads shatter, because they will. When they get really dry, they'll shatter and you'll lose your seed. And store the ripe seed in a moisture-proof container in a dark, dry, cool place, and use it in less than 3 years. And I brought with me a copy of the book that I mentioned, the New Vegetable Growers Handbook, Frank Tozer. I have a copy of that if you can take a look at it if you like on the table. It's one of my favorite vegetable grower advice books. I also brought copies of a couple of seed catalogs that are good sources for onions. And on your handout, I have some more resources that I've added. This was one that I've had on this program for a couple of years. But these catalogs, High Mowing in Vermont, Fedco in Maine, Johnny's in Maine, Comstock Ferry, Baker Creek, which is down in Connecticut now, and Territorial, which is out in Oregon, all of those catalogs have great growing advice in them. So they'll give you at the beginning of a particular section, like onions, they'll give you in a nice capsule form the basic advice for how deep to plant them, how long from sowing to harvest, and those kinds of things. So they're good to have. Even if I don't buy seed from the catalogs, I keep the catalogs on hand just for the growing advice that you can get from them. Several of these companies also have really good websites now. High Mowing's website, they're updating with new articles all the time. If you get on their email list, they'll send you all kinds of things. With all the dependence on online buying now, I still get quite a few seed catalogs because I do order, and I like to have the catalogs to use for my talks, just to show people or to get pictures from them for my programs too.
What kind of bulbs do you use in your shop lights?
What you're trying to get is a full spectrum of light. So what I started doing in the beginning, you could get cool light bulbs and warm light bulbs. So in each of my shop lights, I'd put one cool light bulb and one warm light bulb, and that gave you the full spectrum of color that plants need. They need not only the blues but the warm colors as well. There are also the T bulbs, and I'm trying to remember which T number. You could probably find it if you did a little looking online, which one is the best for the grow lights. It's not stuck in my head, but they're called T fluorescent bulbs that you can get at,
Just fluorescent, or can you use LED?
I don't know if it's technically a fluorescent. It might not be. They're T bulbs, and Home Depot and places like that have them in stock, and those give you a more full spectrum light as well. But yeah, the grow lights are costly, and so I've been able to succeed fine as long as I have that balance. If you just use all cool lights, the plants aren't going to do as well. So a balance between a cool light and a warm light. That I'm very grateful to the Southbridge Cultural Council for their funding of this program through a grant from the Mass Cultural Council.